My name is David Zeidman from Zeidman Development, and I'm here today to talk to you about communication preferences, GDPR, and how to let your constituents, your supporters, tell you what they really want. So, firstly, a little bit about myself. I'm primarily a software developer based in London. Been working with the Raised Edge for over 18 years. Phew, that's longer than I thought it was. Primarily working with non-profits to integrate the Raised Edge and third-party systems, or alternatively to create enhancements to the Raised Edge. And along the way, seen Raised Edge grow from a really undeveloped application to what we see now in NXT as being a really very fine product indeed. So just a disclaimer, as you see here, I'm not a lawyer, so any legal information you hear today, please don't take it at face value. Please do seek legal counsel about what I have to say, and don't rely word for word on exactly everything I might say. I may have got some facts wrong, or may be interpreted differently for your organization. So, spam. I'm sure you're all very familiar with what spam is. We all experience it. We all receive unwanted emails from time to time, even though Google and Gmail, that is, and Outlook and Yahoo are all becoming much better at trapping those spam content and putting it into the junk email box. We do occasionally see that and do slip through. So the last thing we want as organizations is to be accused of sending spam. So how can we best protect our organizations by ensuring that the communications we send out to our supporters are not regarded as being malicious content or as being unwanted content? So first, a few acronyms. Just important, very quickly, just to go through some things you'll hear today, just in case you're not familiar with the terms or the things we're talking about. So, CAN spam, controlling the assault of non-solicited pornography and marketing. So I didn't know that spam stood for that. But anyway, that was first enforced in 2003, and probably was one of the first legal devices to prevent the spread of unwanted emails. Before that, the internet really was Wild West, and anything could be sent, and no one was under any legal obligation to prevent that from being sent. So more recently, we have Canadian anti-spam legislation, first enforced in 2014, that went a long way to improving upon the CAN Spam Act, and didn't just cover emails. And then finally, perhaps most heard of most recently is GDPR. Again, first enforced in 2018, but been a long time in the making. General Data Protection Regulation, covering Europe and European citizens throughout the world. And finally, Spice Girls, first formed in 1994, consisting of Sporty, Posh, Ginger, Baby, and Scary Spice. For those of you who are too young to remember or have seen them, they were a very big pop band in the 90s and the early noughties, and very much were the proponents of girl power. So yes, and with their help today, we will be explaining exactly how communication preferences can be implemented in the organization, and GDPR and other legal devices implemented in order to protect you as an organization. So of course that first lyric from the Spice Girls song, Wannabe, I'll tell you what you want, or what you really, really want. Of course, when they first wrote this, they were very clear as to the fact that it was neither GDPR nor CASL compliant, and they had the great foresight to realize this at the time. We clearly can't just decide that we can send whatever we want to our supporters. There has to be some preference from them as to what's being sent. So the consent, and then we look at the three different laws compared. We have, first of all, CAN spam, which was very much at the forefront, very much one of the first laws out there to cover the flow of emails. But it was much an opt-out mechanism, so that if I was receiving lots of emails I didn't want, I would have to opt out. It wasn't the fact that I would initially opt in. So as soon as someone got hold of my email address, they could send me emails about all sorts of things, whether that be legitimate content, or whether it be spoofing or malicious content, or unpleasant content. And indeed, many spammers would have a disclaimer at the bottom of their emails to say that this email is not spam because it conforms to CAN spam, i.e. we're sending it to you anyway until you opt out. So whilst it was a very good attempt to start with CAN spam, it had a lot of shortcomings, and both CASL and GDPR did proceed to overcome those by working as opt-in laws, so that only those supporters, those constituents who opted in to receive communication would actually receive it, rather than having to place the onus on them to opt out. And then, of course, that leads us to Spice Girls' second lyric in that same song, which is far more relevant, far more insightful, because they realized at that time, of course, that we should only be sending what the supporter really wants and not what we want to give them, making them fully the first people in the world to be both GDPR and CASL compliant. So what is the geographical scope of these two laws, these three laws rather? So we have CAN spam, which was, again, started in the US, but I have to say that it was very much taken on board by larger companies that wanted to spread their message throughout the world, and they adopted the CAN spam legislation just as a bare minimum to ensure that they could carry on sending their email marketing. So even though it was originated from the US, it was very much used throughout the world as a beacon for a legal basis for sending emails out to people. CASL sent from or received in Canada. So that's just for people who are based in Canada, or rather people who send or receive communications from Canada. So if you're Canadian sitting on the other side of the border, then you can be spammed as much as you don't wish, or as the spammer would wish. And then finally, GDPR covers all EU and European Economic Area citizens, wherever they are based in the world. So if they're sitting in London, or in Paris, or Berlin, or equally in Orlando, or in New York, or San Francisco, wherever they might be based, this law applies to them. Of course, it's much harder for the EU to enforce it if they're sitting outside of that geographical area, but nevertheless, the point of the law is that it applies to all European citizens everywhere. So that means that if you have anybody in your database who is from that area, then that law applies to you too. So let's take a look at the material scope of these three laws. What is it they cover exactly? Well, CAN spam referred to electronic messages, which is somewhat ambiguous. Of course, back in 2003, the most obvious choice or description of that would be email. There perhaps wasn't as much around otherwise, but no, they're somewhat ambiguous. And of course, as soon as the instant message came onto the came into the fore, that was no longer, that wasn't covered, or it was not necessarily thought of as being part of that definition. And what's more, that excludes business-to-business communication, so that me as a business owner, if I'm sent some email content that I disapprove of or that I didn't want, then it makes it much harder for me to blame the or put the onus back onto the business and say, well, you've broken canned spam. So I'll say, well, no, because you're a business, we're business. That's excluded from this law. That's somewhat ambiguous as to what's covered within that scope. Likewise, Castle, they talk about commercial electronic messages also being somewhat ambiguous. I think there's perhaps more detail in that law to determine exactly what's covered, but I suppose in wanting to make it as future-proof as possible, it is somewhat ambiguous, so they can interpret it differently depending if something new has been developed. Whereas GDPR covers all personally identifiable data, so it's not just messages, it's any data that's sent or stored by an organization or by a company. So obviously that covers emails, instant messaging, social media content, but also the content that you have in your database. So that if you're storing information about somebody in your database, it has to be GDPR compliant. They have to have consented to that. There are, of course, some exceptions to all of these rules, which we'll have a brief look at shortly. But ultimately, someone has to have consented to store their data. So yes, exceptions to those rules. Canned spam, there were plenty of them. There were religious and political, as well as many that aren't particularly well defined. So again, very much a get-out clause for the spammer to say, well, actually, no, this is a religious message, this is a political message, this is something else which isn't covered by canned spam. Castle did tighten the definitions to a great extent, but nevertheless have some well-defined exceptions. Internal company communications, product upgrades. If you have if you're selling a product to somebody, you're able to send out information about product upgrades, etc. Whereas GDPR went even further still and defined in total 5 alternate legal bases for processing data. I guess they've got 5 different good reasons why you could do it. Those include those include a legal contract. So if you have a legal contract with an individual that says, you have a membership with us as part of a legal contract. As part of that contract, we will send out a quarterly newsletter. That's part of our contract to you. Then, of course, there's criminal or other legal use, which isn't contract-based. So, for example, if you come across information about your constituent who is deemed to have done something illegal, you're able to sort that and pass that on to the relevant authorities. And likewise, the authorities themselves are able to store that information if it's criminal or otherwise. Vital interest information, so medical history, for example, you're able to store as well, or rather, hospitals and doctors are able to store. It's unlikely, very unlikely, unless perhaps you are directly involved with patient health, that you could store legitimately have a good reason for storing that data. And then the fifth in this case, fifth alternative is used by public authorities, so for tax purposes, for example. So if you're a tax authority. Then there's one more, actually, I should say 6, which perhaps is the hardest to define and consequently the hardest to justify, but is called legitimate interest. And that is where you as an organization can say that it is in your legitimate interest to send out emails or hold this data about a person. Now, it's very hard for me to stand and define exactly what that covers. So if you feel that that's you are covered by that, then you should seek legal counsel. But it is the hardest of all of them to justify because it's so imprecise. And then, of course, consent is being the one that we've already covered. So when we hear about GDPR in the words of Spice Girls, to paraphrase the Spice Girls, really GDPR now becomes constituent power. All the power is back in the hands of the constituents. They themselves can decide what communications they want to receive from us, and no longer is the case that we can send out whatever we like to them without any form of address. So when we look at Raised Edge, what have been the options for storing consent information? Well, let's have a quick look at those. So previously, or rather even now, even today, there are checkboxes that we can use for when someone requests an email, when we say we should send email to this address or do not contact the person. These are very much binary, on or off, yes or no. There's no information about when they decided that they wanted to receive or did not want to receive our communication. There's no information about what the context was, where did they decide this, in what form, what scenario, what was the reason for them deciding this, and nothing about who decided. And of course, then there's no history either. It's either on or off, and we don't see what they've had in the past. So whilst it has its uses, it's not ideal for storing its communication preference, really. So a little bit better, but not really much better. It's still a binary choice. It's listed code. It's still on or off. But of course, with listed codes, we can then decide. We can make it much broader. We can define our own values. So obviously, we could have no newsletter, but we could also have no annual appeal sent through MailChimp, or we could have no phone calls about upcoming events. We could definitely make our own definitions of specific codes and of our own communication preferences. But while it can be much broader, again, there's still no timeline, there's still no history, there's still no information about when this was decided or in what context. So still pretty lame by itself. So up until perhaps this year or the end of last year, the area of choice for most people who want to store detailed information has been attributes. And yes, they can work for an organization. They can store that information. You can store a date. You can store a comment to say what the context was when the person decided they don't want to receive the information. You could, in theory, you could have a category of communication preference with a description of the type, no newsletter, no phone calls, and then a date to say when it happened and a comment to say where it happened or context. Or alternatively, you could have a category of no phone calls and with a description of a date, and then have a from date and a to date on the attribute. And not only that, you could have multiple attributes so that you could retain the history of when somebody said they want to receive information or when they no longer want to receive the information. And to an extent it works, but it's somewhat cumbersome to report on. It's very difficult. Firstly, you have very many attributes. You might have to find the most recent attribute if you're keeping history. You may struggle to look through other attributes you have. So there's no sort of one definitive answer to, or no easy way of determining exactly what the best method for this is. So finally, this year was the consent module being released, and this is what we're going to talk about now. So yes, so moving on to the consent module combined with explicit codes. And I think this is actually Blackboard did a very good job here of capturing the requirements of GDPR. The consent module consists of many records of consent, each capturing a point in time and a certain agreement by the end user as to what their preference is. So it'll capture whether they opted in, whether they opted out. It'll capture exactly what the channel was, whether it was email, whether it was text message, whether it was social media. And then if you want to, as an organization, you can split that up further by choosing a category for each of those channels, or several categories to divide that up. It will capture the person who entered it and the current privacy policy, or the privacy policy at the time of the communication preference. So there we have a lot of detail around that consent record, but also then we have all that is rolled up into one particular preference, which is the explicit code. So that corresponds therefore to a explicit code, and we get an output, if you like, which can be easily reported on. So let's take a little look at that. So here we see in RayZ7 the consent record, and I would say that a lot of preparation goes a long way into making this work for your organization. You really need to think about how you communicate with your donors and your supporters, how you intend to communicate with them, what sort of feedback they give to you is what they do and don't want to hear from you about, and also look at your current explicit codes. How do you currently, or your attributes, how do you currently track their communication preferences, and design a consent together with explicit code system which works for you. And out of the box, it's pretty empty. There's no channel and category combinations. There's no sources there, so you're very much free to put in whatever you like. So when you do set it up, you do so in the configuration area of Razor's Edge under business rules and consent options. And here we see an example where we have the channel of email with a specific category of MailChimp. Of course, if you're using Chimpagration, you may very well want to have a specific category of MailChimp, so this is fed through from Chimpagration into Razor's Edge nicely. So when somebody then decides they want to receive your newsletter, or they want to opt out of the newsletter, in this case, they'll be assigned a no newsletter explicit code. And conversely, when they decide they want to opt in, that no newsletter explicit code will be removed. So it's very well worth thinking about how you're going to track your communication preferences and how they'll correspond to explicit codes. It's also worth bearing in mind that if you don't supply a channel in a category combination, then you won't be allowed to use it. So only the ones that are listed in this configuration can be used in the front end or on the decision record in Razor's Edge. So let's have a quick look of how we add a consent record to a Razor's Edge record. So we'll take Victoria Beckham, aka Posh Spice. As you can see here, she has no explicit codes and no consent records. So when we press the consent button, we see that there's no consent records. And then we can add a new consent by pressing the new consent button. So we've added information here in advance. So we've got channel of email, category MailChimp. She's opted out. The consent statement that she was responding to was, I would like to receive communication from you. This is done within Chimpagration on this date. And we have this privacy policy. So pressing OK. That's then added to her list of consents. And we can see all the detail there as well. And then pressing close, we can see that as per our business rules configuration, the no newsletter explicit code has been added to her record as well. So very recently, this is also added to NXT. So we can take a quick look at how that's been implemented in NXT. It's slightly different, slightly easier to add multiple consent records in one go. So here we have Emma Bunton's record, aka Baby Spice. So we can see there's very little on this record here at all. just going to zoom in and look at her consent area. As you can see, there's no consent record there found at all. But we can quite easily add a consent. So we press the Add Consent button. And this time we'll get more options to enter which channels did she respond to. Or what was the question that she was responding to, which channels did they cover. So in this case, we're going to answer that it was for email, mail, and phone. So I tick those boxes and press the select. So then we're taken to a new screen where we have to say for each of the channels, which response does she give. We'll see also that for email, you have to select a category. There's no possibility of having an empty category. So let's go in and select that category. And in this case, we've got MailChimp or we've got a magazine. So we'll select MailChimp and fill out the rest of the form here. So we've selected MailChimp. It says that she opted into receive MailChimp newsletters and opted in for mail, but opted out phone. So we can go ahead and fill out the details by going to the details area. And in this case, we see the consent that she responded to was give me everything you've got, just don't phone. And that was part of the March 2018 privacy notification. So when we save that, we can see that those 3 consent records are then added to the consent area in NXT and consequently also in Razor's Edge 7. Now the nice thing about NXT is that when we add further consent records, rather than having a long list of consent, which is hard to look through, where the email and category combinations match, they back up. They're hidden behind the existing one. So for example, if we now go ahead and add an opt-out for mail, you can see now that there's the mail one there on the top and with one older record. So there's the newer opt-out date of the 9th to 12th, and behind it is the older one which we submitted just earlier. So a much tidier way of doing it in the modern interface, of course, as you'd expect. So what are the implications of this consent module on reporting? Of course, we still need to send out newsletters, or send out appeals and mailings to our constituents. So how should we use the consent module in order to carry on doing that? Well, what we have to remember is that the consent records that we have are an audit trail of preferences. There's no real need to query on those consent records themselves. The idea being that when you save a consent record, the output of it is the specific code. So the outcome of your preferences on consent records are the specific codes. So therefore, you can carry on querying in the same way you've done before, but using explicit codes. If you're using explicit codes before, that's ideal. If you're using attributes or some other mechanism, then the switch over to explicit codes shouldn't be too difficult, as long as you have those business rules set up. So if we look at an example, the consent record may say that on August 21st, 2018, I no longer want to receive my monthly newsletter. And then we told you this when we unsubscribed online. Obviously, if you're trying to query through that amount of information in the consent record, it's much more cumbersome to do so than just to look at the explicit code where it says no newsletter. For reporting purposes, there's no need to have a date. There's no need to have the context or the scenario or who entered the consent record. You only really want to have the outcome of that consent. If you ever need to audit your consent, then clearly you look at the consent record and you query it over that point. But for producing mailings or producing marketing material or communications with your constituents, you just need to look at the specific codes. So one real takeaway point that I can't stress hard enough from this is that because all reporting flows from the specific codes, then really need to lock them down. by default, they're still available. You can still delete them. You can still add to them. But in my opinion, every single organization making use of consent records should lock them down. You want your consent records to drive your specific codes. Your specific code should really be read-only. It should just be the outcome of your consent. And therefore, I would suggest go to security and lock down specific codes so no one can go in and delete them or change them on a consent record. So we have to remember that consent doesn't just lie within Razor's Edge. If you think about your constituents, they interact with you on many different levels. And while some of that ends up in the Razor's Edge, much of it will be in other systems, whether it's an email marketing suite, whether it is social media, whether it is phone calls into the organization, whether it's letters. However it is, that data needs to be consistent. So we have same preferences everywhere. So getting data from Razor's Edge to other systems, we need to make sure that we're able to export it easily. Now again, there's no real need to export the consent records. It's the outcome of those consent records which are important. So as long as we make sure we're able to export the specific codes from Razor's Edge into the other system, then that should be sufficient. Of course, ideally, you want to make use of a dedicated application that integrates the two systems. And I'm happy to help with that. But we do need to export the statistic code over to the systems. And equally, if we're storing consent in another system, whether that is in the form of complete audit or whether it is just on a simple unsubscribe basis or simple preference basis corresponding to specific codes, we want to be able to get that back into Razor's Edge in the form of consent records. So again, we can import consent records, but ideally we'd like to have some kind of integrated application that brings in consent. So just to wrap this up, where do I see the future of consent? Well, clearly we talked about how GDPR certainly make a big impact on European citizens' lives, but I don't see it ending there. I see that becoming a de facto standard across the world, or at least across the Western world, that those people that care about individuals' consent. I think once where CAN-SPAM was a leading light in the legal process, offering guidance as to how email marketing should be treated, I think that GDPR, or at least the basis of GDPR, will also be that individuals should be able to offer their consent to how they're communicated with. And in the future, that may well be that there are portals, consent portals, where somebody will be able to go into a portal and see their record and offer consent there, and then different systems will feed into that or will read from that, so that individuals don't have to offer their consent to very many different systems, but rather just for a unified place. Whether that comes from everyone tapping into NXT, or whether NXT will tap into another system, another portal system where consent is given. Who knows? But I guess watch this space and we'll see what happens. And on that note, I will take any questions you may have. Thank you.